Hello, I'm Alana, and on this channel we talk about biblical geography and other things related to the physical context of the Bible. Today we're going to talk about how this knowledge may impact how we see many commentaries, or to quote someone I used to teach with, wrong, 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 holy cow, you're all wrong. I was recently listening to Amy Bird's The Hope in Our Scars, and it caused me to reflect on something I've been trying to put into words for a while. She has a lot of references to the Song of Songs or Song of Solomon, which she often just calls the song. She, like many of the church fathers and mothers, take this book to be an allegory of Christ and his bride, the church. On one hand, this bothers me, since it seems to totally ignore the original context of the book, as well as how it was typically understood in Judaism. On the other hand, I think Rabbinic Judaism would be the first to say that one passage of the Bible can be understood and applied in many different ways. If you ever read parts of the Talmud or other rabbinic commentaries, you can pretty easily find two rabbis who seem diametrically opposed on the interpretation of the passage, but they're both considered right in at least some sense. I'm oversimplifying here, but you get the gist. In the branch of American Christianity I'm most familiar with, our thought process tends to follow the Greek philosophers more than the rabbis, and perhaps as a result of that, we tend to believe there is only one right interpretation and that nothing in the Bible is an allegory unless it specifically says so. So when I hear Amy talking about the church and saying important things that need to be heard by people in power, but using Bible passages that I understand very differently, I feel that tension. It's the same tension I feel almost every time I listen to a sermon or make a video here myself. A lot of it boils down to the question of who or what is right or wrong, and how important is it to be right. In this specific example, is it possible for Amy to be wrong about her interpretation of the Song of Solomon, but right in the application she draws from it? To speak more generally, believe it or not, most pastors and Bible teachers don't have a degree in historical geography of the Bible. So most of the time when I listen to a sermon, I have to try to ignore my inner critic that notices every time a place name is mispronounced or more often just ignored. And while ignoring place names or other relevant context makes me sad, it doesn't necessarily have a huge impact on the lesson. But sometimes the error is more pronounced. Sometimes the teacher is ignorant of relevant details that cause them to miss the entire point of the passage. And when this happens, what do we do? What do I do? In another book I read recently, I came across a quote from Augustine on this exact conundrum, and his conclusion resonates with me and my experience. I'll read the quote here. "Whoever then thinks that he understands the Holy Scriptures, or any part of them, but puts such an interpretation upon them as does not tend to build up this twofold love of God and our neighbor, does not yet understand them as he ought. If, on the other hand, a man draws a meaning from them that may be used for the building up of love, even though he does not happen upon the precise meaning which the author whom he reads intended to express in that place, his error is not pernicious, and he is wholly clear from the charge of deception." Pernicious, having a harmful effect, especially in a gradual or subtle way. And then he continues on here. "Whoever takes another meaning out of Scripture than the writer intended goes astray, but not through any falsehood in Scripture. Nevertheless, as I was going to say, if his mistaken interpretation tends to build up love, which is the end of the commandment, he goes astray in much the same way as a man who, by mistake, quits the high road, but yet reaches through the fields the same place to which the road leads. He is to be corrected, however, and to be shown how much better it is not to quit the straight road, lest, if he get into the habit of going astray, he may sometimes take crossroads or even go in the wrong direction altogether." To be fair, I think Augustine is also wrong at times, but in this case, I think he's on the right track. I have known many people who love Jesus and want to follow him, and sometimes their teaching totally misses the point of the passage, but the application that they draw points people to valid Christian practices and virtues. Perhaps they are taking the knowledge from other parts of the Bible and trying to fill in places they don't fully understand. I have also known people to totally miss the point of the passage and then veer off into problematic applications that also miss in leading people to love Christ and each other more. These are the pernicious errors. There's also a third group, teachers who are so concerned about being right and not missing the point that they themselves fail to love and then fail to point others to love. This is also pernicious, and I mention it especially because I think that it is my temptation to worry more about being right than loving others, and I do want to guard against that. The Bible speaks many times on the primary importance of love. So I think Augustine is on the right track when he centers love as the main goal of all teaching. So, to circle back to the title and topic of the video again, arguably every commentary you've ever read or seen has been wrong at some point. I do want to delineate some ways that I've observed that commentaries can go wrong. First, they can go wrong by the besetting sins or blind spots of the author. An example of this is Jonathan Edwards. His work has recently come under more scrutiny because he himself owned slaves. As Dr. Anthony Bradley said on a podcast, we have to put our faith in the scriptures, not our faith in our historical figures. All of our historical figures had blind spots, all of them. When I think about Edwards, my question is always what was lacking in his theology that allowed him to be a slaveholder and go to bed with a clean conscience? It is a reminder that his theology was in some respects truncated because it missed things. His theology was not robust enough. Edwards' theology was small. A second way that commentaries can go wrong is through the author's own context and cultural moment. Let's take Augustine, for example. I haven't studied a lot of his writings, but his philosophy permeates our modern understanding of Christianity. There were a lot of things he got right. I don't want to pick a fight with the Augustine lovers, but also things he got wrong. We need only to look at his context to see some of the places where error crept into his teaching. First off, we must recognize that he was writing from Africa over 300 years after the life of Christ. This makes his context significantly different from what the biblical authors would have known, so we can't be surprised if he misunderstands that context or allegorizes something that could have been meant literally, like when he suggests that the 5 husbands of the Samaritan woman were a reference to the 5 books of Moses. Second, if we look at how both women and Jews were viewed in his day and by him specifically, it's not surprising that we find misogynistic and anti-Semitic themes in some of his writing. For example, when he is talking about the Samaritan woman in John 4, he calls the man she's living with currently her paramour, and also implies that as a woman she was maybe not that smart. I don't think he was the first to make those assumptions, but he definitely wasn't the last, and I'm sure that his categorization influenced people who came after him. Even today, the default assumption seems to be that she is a promiscuous woman, but as we talked about in an earlier video, the text never says that, and there are several reasons to believe that she was not. A third issue can be trusting the wrong sources. If someone writing a commentary relies solely on Edwards or Augustine, they are likely to pick up those misconceptions and mistakes and duplicate them if they don't have some sort of guardrail in place to keep them out of those errors. It is wise to read widely, read a lot of different perspectives, think about the Christian tradition, not just one person, to quote Dr. Anthony Bradley again. A fourth place that commentaries can go wrong is gaps in knowledge. Of course, everyone has things they don't know. For example, I know that my language skills are lacking. So while I will bring up language where I think it is relevant or helpful, I try not to base any of my arguments solely on language unless I have read other experts who can back me up. I think more of a problem comes in when commentators are unaware of their own lack of knowledge. Sometimes you just don't know what you don't know. Let's consider Matthew Henry for a minute. His commentaries were read and referenced by some of the most influential pastors and theologians in recent history, including George Whitefield and Charles Spurgeon. I haven't heard him directly referenced as much recently, but there's no doubt that his influence continues to be felt. He died in 1714. Edward Robinson and Sir Flinders Petrie, to name a couple people foundational in the studies of biblical geography and modern archaeology, hadn't even been born yet. There were some things that Matthew Henry simply couldn't have known, and he probably didn't even realize his lack. Now, though, 3 centuries later, we should not only be reading his work with a somewhat critical lens, but also the work of people who were influenced by him. We know things he didn't know. Of course, we should also learn a lesson of humility there. There are doubtless gaps in our own knowledge that will need to be corrected. However, for Matthew Henry, these specific gaps in knowledge of geography and archaeology were inevitable considering when he lived. That is no longer the case today. And yet, these and other fields related to Bible context are often ignored and neglected. I live in a town that has 2 seminaries, but when I checked out their course offerings, I found only 1 class that even touched on biblical geography. Archaeology wasn't even mentioned in either course catalog. There were quite a few courses that addressed culture, but mostly in the context of making the gospel relevant to various cultures, and very little, if any, about the cultures from which the Bible grew. Frankly, I find this quite shocking and possibly bordering on negligent. How can these seminaries train people to teach the Bible without at least an introduction to the lands and cultures that shaped it? Now, I do realize that just because geography is my passion doesn't mean everyone has to be the same. But I feel like I'm asking for a relatively small reform. 1 3-hour course of the 72 hours required for an MDiv degree could be dedicated to the study of geography and other physical contexts. Or, for current pastors and teachers, find a good Bible atlas or similar and spend 15 minutes or so looking up a passage or location mentioned. Or take an online course to get a broader view. I'll try to put some helpful resources in the description if you would like to try to fill in some of these gaps. We all have gaps in our knowledge, but there are ways to fill some of those in. Of the 4 ways the commentaries go wrong that I have listed, this one is possibly the easiest to start to correct. So yes, I think everyone is wrong, myself included. Some of these errors are not our fault, since none of us have perfect knowledge. And some of these errors are not pernicious. On the other hand, it can be difficult to be certain that any error is not pernicious. Augustine treating the Samaritan woman like a sinner seems like a fairly minor thing, but if through that and similar comments his general view of women trickles down and impacts how we see and treat women in Christianity today, it can be more problematic than it originally appears. While Augustine, Matthew Henry, and Jonathan Edwards can no longer acknowledge and correct the errors they made in their lifetimes, pernicious or not, we do not have that limitation. We can still learn and correct our errors. And this is part of why books like Amy Bird's are so important. They tell us that people are being hurt by certain teachings and church systems and give us a chance to change and repent and better our pursuit of loving God and neighbor. And this is also what I hope to do here, perhaps in a smaller way. When I was in college, I worked as a camp counselor during the summers. One of our jobs was leading hikes. Most of the hikes were pretty straightforward. Once you got to the trailhead, you could follow the trail to the goal location. There were, however, a couple of hikes where it was possible to go awry. There was one specific hike to a waterfall, and at least once a summer, people would get lost on it. It wasn't a very difficult hike, but there was one place where the trail appeared to keep going straight, But once you learn to recognize the place, you would notice a big boulder and some fallen trees and know that you'd have to cut up the hill a few feet in order to hit the correct trail. The boulder was big enough to take a group picture on, but small enough to blend in if you weren't paying attention. After all, it was the Boulder River Valley. There wasn't exactly a shortage of boulders. We tried to mark the area more clearly with surveyor's tape, but still. Every summer, a leader would be distracted or deep in conversation, and they would miss the signs and continue on what looked like a clear trail, only to realize later they weren't going where they wanted to go. Then they would have to backtrack to find the turn they had missed and decide if they still had time to make it to the waterfall that day, or if they needed to head back to camp. Because I had been on that hike so many times, I got pretty good at recognizing where to turn. And because I knew how many people had forgotten, I was extra wary to keep an eye out. I don't think I ever got lost on that hike, though I did take a wrong turn or two on a couple other hikes. And I think this is a great addition to Augustine's illustration. Some people are better at recognizing some trail signs than others. Some have been here before and know what to watch for. Because of my training and experience, I'm more attuned to signs relating to physical context, history, geography, archaeology, culture, etc., which I think is especially important because they are the signs that are often overlooked. But other people are better at recognizing other trail markers. We need each other. We need to keep listening to various voices to help point out where we go wrong, because no one is infallible. So I want to try to be a sort of trail guide. I want to help point out what to look for, how to recognize those metaphorical boulders that tell us we may be about to go the wrong way. But I also want to recognize that a group of hikers may miss the boulder, but if they want to trailblaze their way up the side of the mountain, they can still get to the metaphorical waterfall of loving God and neighbor better. For example, I recently posted a few thoughts on the new House of David series. At least one person was really shocked that I didn't like it because it deepened their faith. I still think that the production missed a few interpretive boulders in telling the story of the 5 small stones, and I still would recommend not getting your theology from Amazon Prime. But if watching that series deepens your faith and causes you to love God and humanity more, I have no problem with that. Bushwhack your way to that waterfall. Similarly with Amy Bird's book, I haven't studied the Song of Solomon extensively, so I want to allow that perhaps her interpretive framework has more merit than I immediately see. From my point of view, it looks like she missed the boulder asking, what would this have meant for the original audience, before skipping to what it means for her today. But in spite of that, she says a lot that is true of Christ and his church. And it's not as if she's blazing her own trail. She's following an interpretive path traveled by many before her. This doesn't necessarily mean that it's right, but it may mean that it's been found to be a safe way to get to the correct destination. So I'm going to try to keep pointing out boulders that people have missed in their interpretation. But I'm also going to try to ultimately point people to the waterfall of increasing love for God and neighbor. Are all commentaries wrong? Yeah, probably. But if they do the work of increasing our love for God and our neighbor, then maybe they're also right. But realistically, I'm still going to yell at them if they ignore place names.